Signore e signori, un benvenuto caloroso a nome di tutta la nostra comunità e grazie per la vostra presenza qui dall'Accademia Britannica, il nostro centro internazionale per eccellenza nelle ricerche. È un piacere accogliervi qui stasera per la nostra serie di conferenze serali che siamo privilegiati a presentarvi ogni mercoledì. It's a pleasure, a privilege and a joy for me to be able to welcome Professor Ron Ridley to deliver tonight's Wednesday evening lecture. Ron Ridley is Professor in Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne, Australia. He has rightly been widely recognized and decorated with a range of prestigious academic awards, appointed Fellow of the Society for Antiquaries, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Ron's work, his scholarship, his publications, and indeed the generation of scholars and students that he has inspired, many of whom have associations with this particular institution, have all made an invaluable contribution to the study of ancient and 18th century Rome, humanism, urbanism, philology, antiquarianism, and he has opened up new and fruitful paths of inquiry around the history of disciplines, and notably the history of archaeology. As we'll see tonight, Ron is one of the rare scholars who is as at home in the time of Antoninus Pius as he is in the time of the 6th Pope Pius. Ron has kept the printers of esteemed university presses busily rattling away in recent times with outstanding publications on Livy and the topography of Rome, the enigma of Servius Tullius, Carlo Feia, and a wonderful analysis of the political autobiography of Augustus, published with Brill, to name but a few, and also pause to recommend his latest monograph, The Prince as Poisoner, the trial of Sigismondo Chigi, which was published with the Vatican Press only last year. Ron is well known and well loved in these corridors, and we at the British School of Rome are very proud to include you as a dear friend, and we are immensely grateful for your endeavours in supporting and promoting the work of the British School of Rome in the context of the Australian Academy. Our ties to Australia are a long-standing and central aspect of our mission at the British School at Rome. This well-known, much-cherished pillar of scholarship, Professor Ridley, is here to discuss a little-known pillar, the column of Antoninus Pius, whose recovery was one of the major archaeological events of early 18th century Rome. We're very grateful to you for coming here from the other side of the world. We look forward to you turning upside down the story of the column of Antoninus Pius. And with great pleasure, please welcome the rigorous research and refined rhetoric of Ron Ridley. Thank you.
I've never had an introduction like that before. Really, I never had. It's so generous. It's a great pleasure, it's a great honour to be here. I'm deeply aware of the honour done to someone from the other side of the world like myself, who can come to the British School and offer a lecture on research that one does on Roman archaeology. There's no better forum in which to present it. The fate of the column of Antoninus Pius. That's the only representation we have of it from antiquity. It's, of course, a bronze coin. Shortly after the column was set up by his sons by adoption, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. It would have been set up shortly after his death in 161, shortly after his cremation. The trouble is that we don't have the column anymore, for reasons that I'll tell you. The story I'm going to tell you tonight is a mixture of tragedy, of absurdity, of total incompetence, of political chicanery. It's a disgraceful story. No one's ever told it before. The paradox is that this is probably the best documented archaeological excavation in Rome until modern times. In just a couple of years after the column was brought back to people's attention in 1703, there were half a dozen monographs published about it, but no one's taken any notice on, and lots of other material. So there's the only evidence we have from antiquity. And I'm going to tell you that another paradox is that it disappears from view after that coin. It was originally some 15 metres high, in other words, half the height of the two other famous columns, which we all know so well, the columns of Trajan and the column of Marcus Aurelius. They are centenarian, that's the term applied to them, meaning 100 Roman feet, which is about 30 metres high. This one is half that height, was half that height, whereas they are of marble. This one was of Egyptian red granite, and whereas both of those were decorated, this one was completely plain. That's perhaps, we begin to search for reasons why so little notice was taken of it. One of the reasons might be its lack of decoration, of course, I'm sure it is. There is a splendid book about it by a young American scholar, Lisa Vogel, V-O-G-E-L, an excellent monograph, which was really her PhD thesis, but she simply had no idea. It's full of solid work, but she simply had no idea of the story that she had her hands on. An honourable mention should also be made, I promised Tom I had a name to conjure with, of the man who was in charge here when we first appeared on the scene in 1971. John Ward Perkins was still the director of the British School. And one of his, and forgive me, I have to explain that I don't normally use notes, but this story is so complicated and so detailed, and the details count, that you forgive me if I resort to them. John Ward Perkins was especially interested in the history of quarrying, and so he's the only person who actually paid attention to the pre-Antonine history of the column, because it has two Greek inscriptions on it. I'll show you one of them shortly, which mention that it was quarried in the 9th year of Trajan, which is 105-106, and it gives the name of an architect whose name is half missing. We just have the end of it, of course, Ides, and it's thought to be either Aristides or Ward Perkins thought it was Heraclides, because he was known from the quarry at Mons Claudianus. So, this column was quarried 56 years before it was used in 161 to commemorate Antoninus Pius. Ward Perkins thought it might have been intended, but it wasn't used obviously, for the temple of the deified Trajan. Now, as I said, it disappears from history. We have a whole range of sources who are interested in Rome in the Middle Ages and so on. The regionaries, as they're called, the Constantinian regionaries and so on, the medieval pilgrim guides, the Einsiedlensis and whatnot, those of you who are interested in that period of travellers to Rome and what they saw, you don't find any account of them. They mention, of course, only the other two columns, the column of Trajan and the column of Marcus Aurelius. And guess what they call the column of Marcus Aurelius? The Colonna Antoniniana. They got it wrong, you see. They thought the column of Marcus Aurelius was the column of Antoninus Pius. But it's suggested by a couple of people that it never disappeared from view, that it was always visible, at least it's 15 metres high, after all, just the column itself, apart from the pedestal, which is quite a large thing, because that survives. That's in the Vatican Museum. Some of you are thinking, don't I know something about this column? Yes, the pedestal alone survives. Something like 5 or 6 metres was still above ground, so it was never lost. It never had to be discovered, never had to be dug up in the total sense. It did actually have to be excavated, but that's a slightly different story. So, we have no trace of it from the time of antiquity. This coin essentially, there's no literary reference to it until suddenly attention is paid, in 1703. Now, Rodolfo Lanciani, a name to conjure with, in the new edition of his Storia dei Scavi, volume 3, thought that he could find the column shown on the map of Antonio Tempesta, 1593. In fact, Robert Coates Stevens drew my attention to this, and I thank him for it very much. There's the column of Antoninus Pius. And, okay, wait a second. Let's get over here. I'll show you a close up and we'll get it. That was just for orientation. So that's where now Palazzo Chigi is, and that's where now Montecitorio is. It's just somewhere in there, but I'll show you on the close up. Yes. There it is. I think Lanciano must be right. So along here is Marcus Aurelius. The Tempesta map of 1593 perhaps shows it. So in 1703, attention was drawn to this column. Why? Who? In 1703, we have, as I said, half a dozen monographs on the column. One of the most important is written by one of the two Fontanas in the story. Now these people, Carlo the elder, the father, Carlo Fontana, and Francesco, his son. It's only sometime, of course, after you get into things, you realise you have left questions unasked. This always happens with the research, the more complicated it gets. It's only when I get a certain way along the line and have read so much that I suddenly realise there are two Fontanas in question, and nobody is making clear which is meant at any time. Just Cavaliere Fontana. Well, that's extremely helpful. In fact, I have to tell you, by way of preface about the whole thing, that in all the standard reference works on Roman topography, I'm talking about Plattner Ashby and Lexicon Topographicum and Richardson and so on, and a whole host of others, none of these people can get a single thing right about this column. It's a total scandal. I'll tell you now the three dates so you get them fixed in your mind and you begin to take them away with you. The first attempt to do something about it is at the end of 1703. That's when it's excavated down to the pedestal, down to the foundations, and that's when it becomes clear that this is the column of Antoninus Pius. Oh my goodness, so that must be the column of Marcus Aurelius. Then, in 1703, the identity of the columns becomes clear, because this has to be Antoninus Pius, as the inscription tells us. Then the next year is the 1704, October 1704, is the first attempt to raise it, which is a total failure, a disastrous failure, 1704, and the successful raising of it, September 1705. They're the three dates, 3 years in succession, 1703, 1704, 1705. The most documented excavation and elevation and so on that we know of for centuries, but no one reads them, so everything's botched. If you don't believe me, just have a look at some of those standard works of reference. So I won't take the 6 monographs in order. I think we might use them in the way they make sense as a story. So when did attention become focused on, and who was responsible? Well, Carlo Fontana wrote in 1708, he held off for 5 years after the uncovering of the column, wrote his Discorso sopra l'antico Montecitorio. That was one of the origins of Montecitorio, which is now where the Parliament is, as if it was the place where public notices were set up, where Romans in classical Rome were summoned to assemblies and so on. It's a totally fantastic etymology. Carlo Fontana, that's the father in this discourse, explains that he was talking to Nicola del Giudice, who was the Presidente dell'Estrade at the time, a very important papal post. People who held that post always went on to have a cardinalate, as Del Giudice did. And Del Giudice was saying to Fontana about the number of important classical monuments in the Campus Martius. And he mentioned this column of enormous size inside the garden, if you want, inside the garden, or the property of the so-called Fathers of the Mission. Now, in fact, what you can see there is the street of the Fathers of the Mission, which is still called that. If you face Montecitorio, the little street running alongside it on the left is still called Via della Missione. Up that street is where the column was. In other words, instead of haring desperately down Ufficio del Vicario towards Giolitis for a gelato, just wait for a second and look down that street and you'll realise that's where the column was found. So it was Del Giudice who went and saw the column, thought about it again, visited it in August 1703. Impressed by it, he went back to Clement XI, the Pope at the time, and on 21st of September 1703, Clement ordered its clearance. And the base, they cut down, they excavated, of course, a large pit around it, right down to the base, and they discovered the base by the 26th of November. So the next question was, of course, what to do next. We have it in a great pit, something like 20 metres deep, I suppose, in all, taking in the pedestal as well. How to get it out? Well, we have so many accounts of this, and the accounts are all very suspect. The problem is that most people are very anxious to defend the Fontanas, as well they might be, considering the mess they made. There's a big industry in Fontana protection. And the other thing you have to know, to balance against that, about the Fontanas is they have an obsession with being descendants of Domenico Fontana, who was a genius. Domenico Fontana, who moved the Petrine obelisk. As you face St. Peter's, the great obelisk in the centre of the square was originally on the left-hand side of the basilica by the sacristy. And in 1587, Domenico lowered that and brought it round and re-erected it in the piazza. And the story goes that his life was in the balance. He had horses harnessed waiting for him in case something went wrong to flee from Rome, because he would have lost his head. He was working for Sixtus V, who didn't take prisoners. So, what to do? The Fontanas thought that they were descendants of Domenico. Now, there's a recent large book on the Fontanas, and it has a family tree, which is about so big. Now, Domenico is over here, and Carlo and Francesco are over here. But they never stopped talking about how they had to follow Domenico's lead, and he was the great model, and so on. All a fantasy, of course. They were pretentious people, and that generally leads to tragedy. So one of the works which I think is most useful in telling the story, although it tells far from the whole story, is by Giovanni Mario Crescimbene, who gave a racconto di tutta l'operazione per l'elevazione e abbassamento della colonna Antonina in 1705, so after the final successful elevation of it. It's very uncritical of the Fontanas. And to understand that, just before we do, this is a map by Hulson, Christian Hulson, one of the greatest of the topographers of the late 19th and early 20th century. This is the Via della Missione going north, and here is the house of the mission, and here is the column. So that's going back to the time of Alexander VII, e.g. in the 1650s, 1660s. So, of course, the topography was quite different then from what it was even, 50 years later, 1703. Now, to understand what went on, we have this wonderful engraving by Anton von Westerhut, which was published by Piranesi. It's in his Campo Marzio. There are lots of editions which don't have plate 31 because it's not by Piranesi. Someone's lifted it. And I've seen booksellers saying plate 31 is missing, but that's how it was published. Lies, absolute lies. Plate 31 is here in front of you by this great Flemish engraver. And you can see this device, rigged up by the Fontanas, duplicates the huge castello, as it's called in Italian, which was used by Domenico Fontana for the Vatican obelisk. It's made up of, essentially, 6 great uprights. 1, 2, 3, and on the other side, another 3. These are the 6, you come across these technical terms and think, what the devil is going on? 6 candele. What are 6 candles doing here? 6 candles. Well, you finally get your hands on something like battaglia, an historical Italian dictionary, and it turns out to be the word also for a very tall vertical beam. Okay, a candle in a very metaphorical sense. So there are 6 of them, and they take the main weight of the whole operation. The columns there's the column being lowered, actually. It's the successful second operation, 1705, being shown here. Support by dozens of other beams on an angle. The famous tetto, the head of the whole operation, I call it the tower of Castello, for want of another word, try and keep consistency in the translation. So when you say tower, you know I mean Castello. There are 6 huge cross beams here, which held 8 blocks of tackle, 8 enormous blocks of tackle. The trouble was, and the whole thing is to be worked by capstans, which you can see here, each worked by 16 or 20 men. There are some here at the back, some on the side, and some here. The only trouble is the ground level is on 2 levels. You can see here it's about 10 metres high, here it's about 5 metres high. That makes it, and it's very restricted in space, that makes it very difficult to do the essential things, which is to have all the capstans exerting equal pressure. But Crescembeni tells a story about how there was a committee set up of cardinals and so on, and the 2 Fontanas were there, and there was a master mason, Pietro Jacopo Patriarca, and there was a head-on collision between the Fontanas and Patriarca about how to get the column up, and they had to lift it 1 metre, first of all, from its base, so they could swing it to be horizontal and then lower it. Quite an operation. And the Fontanas, of course, wanted the tower like Domenico used for the Petrine obelisk. Patriarch, I'm not quite sure how this was supposed to work. He suggested simply surrounding the column with a mountain of pozzolana, which is volcanic earth, and then digging it out slowly, allowing the column slowly to tip over. Well, I'm not sure how that was really going to work, but what is important to know is the committee said yes, Patriarch's scheme was, quote, easier, quicker, cheaper, and safer, therefore we choose the Fontanas. But we academics know about committees. That makes perfect sense to us. And so this huge tower was constructed, 24 metres high, 18 metres square. The President of the Streets, on the 11th of October, 1704, this is the first attempt in 1704, issued an edict for the conditions of the work. The whole of Rome turned out, of course, to see the operation, but the edict said that there was to be strict silence. No one, where are we? Rome? Strict silence? While people are watching this? Well, if you didn't take it seriously, you made a big mistake. The penalty for people who disrupted the workers, and the work was begun by the blast of a trumpet and stopped by the ringing of bells. And they were worried about the workers trudging around with the capstans, not being able to hear this clearly. So that's why there was the injunction, no noise. Those who contravened that were treated to 3 drops of the corda. And I'm not going to tell you what that inhuman punishment is. If you know about it, I'm sorry. If you don't, just as well you don't. 3 drops of the corda. So, I mean, you couldn't imagine a more ghastly, it would leave you permanently crippled. The workers were issued with a little lead pass, so only the workers could come into the area. I actually found in the archives last week the payment to the lead maker. He was given 5 scudi for the production of the 300-odd passes, little lead tesserae, which were used by the workers. The archives are full of all the details about this, all the payments and all the people working. It's just marvellous. All the workers went to confession, of course, before the operation. There were something like 340, depends how you count. There were 140 people working the capstans. There were 100 sailors working the tackle, because they knew all about ropes. There were 100 carpenters on the spot. And there were 100 soldiers, including 50 Swiss guards, to protect the working area. And what happened? Well, the column began to rise, but a crossbeam, the fatal flaw in the whole operation was the crossbeams. A crossbeam in the tower moved, and so they stopped it. Then 3 days later, on the 18th of October, when the whole of Rome was there, including the Queen of Poland and all the cardinals and the ambassadors from France and so on, and Spain and Venice and Malta, they tried it again. This time, another crossbeam broke. And then one of the capstans broke. And so the whole thing was stopped in October 1704, the disastrous first attempt to raise it. What really happened? Well, we know the answer to that because of the next publication in order of time, not of publication but of sense of the story. A name that some of you might know, Francesco Bianchini, who's most famous as an astronomer. He's the man who put the meridian on the floor of Santa Maria degli Angeli. He was a major scientist, a mathematician, physicist, and so on. He was called in, a great supporter of the Fontanas, we're told. Well, when you read this report he made, you wonder about that. His scientific honesty, I think, overcame his loyalty to the Fontana. He was called in to say what went wrong and to suggest how it might go right. The attempt to raise it on 18 October had failed. What had happened? 2 of the cross beams which held most of the tackle had broken. I told you there were 8 great blocks of tackle. You won't believe this. Half of that, 4 of the huge blocks, were attached to one of the 6 cross beams, and another 2 were attached to one of the other beams. And Bianchini says there had been a total failure by the Fontanas to follow the original plans and the way things were done. You can see from that. There were 6 cross beams, 8 blocks of tackle. Would you put half the beams on one cross, half the tackle blocks on one beam and expect it to stay up? They were crazy, not following any plans at all. Bianchini went into great detail to ask whether, in fact, the whole structure could work. Yes, he said, the whole thing should have worked if you distributed the tackle properly, because he calculated that the column weighed about 300,000 pounds, and it was supported, the column itself, by a cradle, which was 3 huge beams of oak with 8 metal bands around it to hold the whole column in one piece. Because it had a flaw, it was said to have a faulty cross vein, which was a flaw in the granite, which maybe was why Trajan hadn't used it, of course. Yeah? You begin to put things together. Domenico Fontana had to deal, Bianchini calculated, had to deal with the Vatican obelisk, a weight of 1 million pounds. Incredible figures, incredible. And so they didn't follow the plans at all, and no wonder the whole thing failed. Furthermore, the next thing, they'd simply raised it a little way above the pedestal. Now Fontana, whoever it was, Bianchini doesn't specify, now Fontana was saying he was very worried about the whole operation of tilting it, which you can see going on here. He was terrified that when you start to tilt the column from upright position to horizontal, that the base of it would shoot away, that it would slide. And Bianchini simply says, anyone who understands what they're doing wouldn't be the slightest bit worried about that. All you have to do is, apparently Fontana's idea was to support the column right in the middle of its balance, right in the middle to have whatever ropes and tackle to support it. Bianchini said you would never dream of doing that. You'd divide the column into 3 sections and you'd have 2 supports. 1/3 of the column, then ropes and whatever, another third, more ropes, so that you'd have it held in balance. It couldn't scoot away, it couldn't tip up. If you're holding it by one point in the middle, it will. So once again, Bianchini says the Fontanas, by implication, if you can read between the lines, and sometimes even the lines themselves can be helpful. There was once a brilliant young colleague of mine who, at a staff seminar, said to someone who was showing off, look, he said, I've got a simple technique for you we might find useful. Before you start trying to read between the lines, why don't you start trying to read the lines themselves? I've always treasured that. I thought, just wonderful. So the whole thing was reinforced, and that's the operation we see here in 1705, in September 1705, illustrated by Westerhut, who was, as I say, a Flemish artist who spent most of his time in Rome. Everything was reinforced, extra struts and the cross beams on top were reinforced, and then with 500 workers, not 340, 500 workers this time, the whole thing was successful in September 1705. So that's how the whole thing was done. But what had happened in 1704? The big question is what happened to the column? Well, we have various possibilities. Lisa Vogel, I think, has one of the most interesting. That as the trumpet blasted and the men started to turn the capstans and say, with the difficulty of the ropes not being equal in tension and so on because of the different levels and whatnot, the men start trudging round, pushing these huge bars attached to the capstans to make them turn. And then the two cross beams break and one of the capstans snaps. What do you think the result is? Lisa Vogel has the suggestion. The whole column, however high it's got, not very high, comes crashing down on its pedestal. And the column already has a flaw in this transverse vein, which makes it prone to damage. Another suggestion is, what about the tackle? When the beams broke, what did the tackle do? Came crashing down straight onto the column. Either way, the column is in severe damage. And the clear message is, from those who were able to tell the truth, that if the column was in one piece when it was cut out of the ground in which it was mostly buried, it ended up by the time it was laid on the ground being in three pieces. And there were jokes, of course. Trinum et unum, the spirit of Pasquino was alive and well, the placards were around. And Trinum et unum, the joke on the Trinity, 3 and 1. This is one column, but it's in three pieces. The wits of Rome, of course, had a field day. Then what happened? Well, the column was then dragged, when it got to the ground, was then dragged around the corner from the house of the mission into Piazza Montecitorio, as we now call it. But before I come to that, some plans. Perhaps I could have got them in a different order. What was to be done with the column now it had been extracted? Well, the plans for it was going to go up anywhere all over Rome, anywhere there was a public space. Clement XI was besotted with this column. He really had become so excited about it. One of the possibilities was, there's the column of Marcus Aurelius. Here's the column proposed of Antoninus Pius. In other words, this is Montecitorio, the Curia Innocentiana as it was then. The column would be a match for Marcus Aurelius. Or, how about the Fontana Trevi? Right in the very middle. Of course, this is the 1730s. The Fontana Trevi is built between the 1730s and the 1760s, the fountain we know now. It took 30 years. So this is just before the main work started. Other proposals were, near San Giovanni in Laterano, virtually anywhere in Rome was going to be set up. But of course, given its state, that was never to be. So, what happened to it? This is a very interesting engraving by a French artist who was in Rome between 1737 and 1742, François Leguet. He worked with Piranesi, and this is Piazza Montecitorio, and there is the column. Covered over by a disgusting kind of shed, where it was seen by lots of important visitors in the 1730s, 1740s. People like Montesquieu in 1729, de Brosse in 1739. They all came along and peered through the slats, and there was the column in pieces, and the pedestal, presumably. That's Leguet. In other words, the street of the mission, the street of the mission is here. So that's Ufficio del Vicario, d'Archduke, this is Montecitorio. So that's where it was seen by so many people. Then it just languished there, blocking the piazza, and people got impatient with it. And so, by the time of Nolli's map, early 1740s it must be, the column is in fact taken back. This is Nolli's great map of 1748. It had been here, under that shed. It's taken back almost to where it had originated. 340, present location of the column. This is the house of the Fathers of the Mission, found in their garden. So back there. To get it out of the way, still under a shed, And what happens is the pedestal is separated. And there we have one of my favourite artists, a bit overlooked, Giuseppe Vasi. He's got his Magnificenza di Roma split into a series of tens on palazzi, piazza, and so on. And this is in the second book on piazza, in groups of 20, I should say, on the Piazza Montecitorio. And there you can see that the pedestal has now been erected. In Piazza Montecitorio, and the column itself is round the corner. Now, there are all kinds of other accounts. We've got masses of contemporary accounts by people who are Romans and so on. Everyone came to see it, everyone read about it. I'll just mention a couple of them because they're wonderful to know of. The most important source we have for events in Rome for the first 40 years of the 18th century, 1700 to 1742, is Francesco Valesio. His wonderful Diario di Roma, edited by Gaetano Scano in 1979 in 6 volumes. Many libraries have it. It's a diary of Rome, day by day. It's just invaluable. He was an observer at all times, making notes. I won't go through it now. He adds certain things and confirms certain things. He said that when work began in 1704, Carlo Fontana, the father, was in charge, for example, assisted by his son, Francesco. Just a small point. There's an eyewitness account also, published in 1821 by a man with antiquarian interest, Francesco Salieri. He thought he found it in the Miscellanea of Cardinal Garampi. Now I thought, because he gives no source. In the Miscellanea of Cardinal Garampi. So I asked my good friend, Dr. Vian, who's the superintendent of the manuscripts room in the Vatican Library, have you ever heard, because I'm joking, have you ever heard of the Miscellanea of Cardinal Garampi? Of course, he says, follow me. Knows every book in that library. And he takes me along to a description, an index in Studia Testi, I think it was, of the various sources. The trouble is that the Miscellanea of Garampi, they're in the secret archive of the Vatican, and they're in no fewer than 36 volumes. I just don't have the patience to look at it because Cancelliere has given us the gist of it. He thought it was Valesio, but Valesio's account we have and has nothing to do with what Valesio says. And so I've called the author of this the Hellenist. Why? Because he gives one main clue to who he was. And that is that he was sent in specially in October 1705 to read the Greek inscriptions on the column. So I call him the Hellenist for obvious reasons. He is one of the few who is extremely critical of the Fontana. So, people came to see it while it was sitting under the shed, and then it was disappeared from view. But what then to do with it, and what then to do with the pedestal? They still had a long way to go and many travels to make. In 1759, and we have the date from a strict contemporary, Ridolfino Venuti, who was writing in 1763, so he can't be telling you about events of the later 1760s. Other people say it's in the 1760s, the fire. It is not. Venuti mentions it in his work published in 1763. A fire destroyed the shed protecting the column itself around the corner opposite the house of the fathers in September 1759. That was virtually the end of any possibility of doing anything with the column. I can't call that a comedy of errors. It's really a comedy of tragedies. I mean, what greater incompetence could you imagine? Just been sitting there now for what? 54 years since its extraction and lowering and so on. Nothing done about it. What about the pedestal? Well, that first of all, it has a complicated history. In 1748, that's what we see here, this is 1752 by Vasi, that had been set up on a base by Ferdinando Fuga. And it remained there until 1789. In July, it was decided that the pedestal should be moved to the Vatican Museums. And it first went to the Cortile of the Pina, the courtyard of the pine cone, in somewhere like the middle of that Grand Cortile. Then, got to get these dates right, sorry, 1789. In 1885, nearly 100 years later, it was moved to the apse in that courtyard, behind the pine cone. And then in 1979, poor devil of a thing, it was moved to the Cortile delle Corazze, where you now can see it if you can fight your way clear of the Sistine Chapel fanatics. Of course, they were all like lemmings charging ahead and charging out. As you're just about to come out of the museum, there's the Cortile delle Corazze, and if you can manage to slip under barriers and not be seen by the guards, you can actually have a view of the pedestal, but no one takes any notice of it. There it is. Well, some big questions to ask. We've made clear who first was interested in the column. As for who was in charge of operations, I've told you that people just talk about Cavaliere Fontana as if that solves all questions. So when you look more closely, you'll find that Crescimbene, whose account I told you, who basically talks about the two operations of 1704 and 1705, said that the plan was drawn up by Francesco the son, whereas Valesio, these are all people who are contemporary observers. How can we have these contradictions? Francesco Valesio, specifies, on the other hand, that Carlo was in charge in 1704, but by 1705 he's just talking about Cavaliere Fontana. What I suppose helps a bit is that in 1706, this is an outrage, in 1706, Clement XI gave Francesco Fontana the son, a prize for his care and efforts in the raising of the column, a mere 3,000 scudi, a fortune, an absolute fortune, an outrage that this man should be given a prize for almost destroying the column completely. I mean, all that waited to be done was to have the fire, and that was it, which just got split the granite, and that was that. Well, I think perhaps the best answer, I'm prepared to suggest, certainly one of the answers has to be taken into account, is the definitive statement by Carlo in his work on Montecitorio. He says, "Because of my advanced age of 66 and finding myself afflicted by gout, what else, and given the ability and understanding of Francesco, the direction was safely bestowed upon him. So the father gives the entire credit to the son, and he is the one who is rewarded by the Pope with the 3,000 scudi." So I think it's probably the work of the son, with the father perhaps observing. Yes. There's a huge debate, if you read all these accounts, about the exact condition in which the column was found. The apologists for the Fontanas are very anxious to say that the column had suffered considerable damage in antiquity. But we know that the damage was done. We'll see it in a minute, I can show you. That's a strange thing, I just put it in as a sidelight. This is Piranesi in his Trofeo in the mid-1770s, who thinks, there's Montecitorio, and here's the house of the fathers, and that's where the column is found. He, for some reason, thought the column had been found here. Don't know what his source was. No one else does either. Just a complete mystery. And here, now this is important, this is Piranesi's Campomarzio again, you see, and this is plate 32, the one following Van Westerhout's engraving. This is one of his composites. Okay? So we have the inscription, we have a view of the left de Cursio, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. We have here the Greek, it's one of the two Greek inscriptions, the one mentioned, I know it's there, it's Trajan's name, and his architect, Greek architect's name, and it's broken off here. But look at the state of the column. That's how it now was. But also, wait till you see the state of the pedestal. What you may go to see in the Vatican and gasp at and be amazed at, well, a true story. This is the left decursio. I'm showing the left decursio at all times. This also had to be extracted. When they got the column out, they then had to remove the pedestal. And it was pinned down with lead clamps to a travertine base, a travertine floor. They simply wrenched it out of the clamps and dragged it up. Now, these are not reliefs, as you know. They're not reliefs, they're almost freestanding sculptures. They're extremely fragile. The damage done to them, everyone admits, the damage done to the pedestal in the removal was enormous. And we'll see that in, that's as it is now. All, of course, what you're looking at is mostly 18th century restoration, because what it looked like when it came out of the ground, there is Vignoli's engraving of it. That's the one we just looked at. Every head is missing, and enormous damage to corners and sides, where it was torn away from the clamps, presumably. And Piranesi's close-up of what we just saw also in his composite, the same thing. Now, huge pieces missing, all here. That seemed to be, in Vignoli's view, kind of flakes. Now it's just huge gaps, no heads. And so, it's the 19th century restoration that is responsible for most of what we see. And that was the work of the director of the Vatican Museums at the time, Giuseppe de Fabrice. In 1841, he described the pedestal as, quote, totally abandoned after its move to the Vatican, Museums, totally abandoned, having suffered great damage, especially, he said, in modern times, ruined and damaged in all parts from the excavation and being moved about, and then more damage done to it by the first restoration under Benedict XIV, particularly because they had used iron clamps, and there's no greater damage you can do to marble sculpture than hold it together with marble clamps, because they rust and split the marble. So they were replaced by de Fabrice with bronze clamps. Yes. And the Greek inscription, de Fabrice didn't see it, couldn't find it, but he was sure he had seen it. Well, he was the director of the Vatican Museums, so he wandered about, and there, sure as eggs, under a stairway, he found the Greek inscription. And it's thanks to him that it's now embedded in the pedestal as we see it in the Vatican Museum. What an incredibly sad story. Incompetence by the Fontanas, who were protected at the highest levels. Cardinals were protecting them, their name. I don't know why. I mean, they were both, well, Carlo was a more influential architect than his son. The son died in 1708, in fact predeceased his father 3 years after the extraction and lowering of the column. So the plans to put it up all failed. There was the Trevi fountain I told you about. There was Piazza di Montecitorio. There was the Basilica of San Giovanni. There was on the Quirinal, of course, near the horse tamers. Everywhere they already had obelisks and so on. They thought of putting it, but it all came to nothing because it was simply left to rot and then destroyed by fire. And so what happened to the column? Well, next time you're in Piazza Montecitorio, look at the famous Augustan column, obelisk, dead in front of Montecitorio, and you'll see large insertions of plugs of red granite. It's red granite, of course. These are the remains of the column of Antoninus Pius. It was used for repairs. Carlo Pietrangeli, my friend, the one-time director of the Vatican Museums, who knew the archives like the back of his hand, said pieces were used to repair Augustus' obelisk, that's the one we just talked about, the Sallustian obelisk at San Trinità dei Monti, at the top of the Spanish Steps, and for stairs in the Palazzo Braschi. And it was even suggested in 1778 that it might be used in Pius VI's rebuilding of the sacristy of the Basilica of St. Peter's. And so I end up by telling you that Cesare DOnofrio, who wrote all these wonderful books, which you can read with great profit on the obelisks and Visitiamo Roma nel Trecento and so on. He was an indefatigable worker, had his own publishing company, and published about 10 volumes of wonderful histories of Rome and particular kinds of antiquities. In an aside, I think he best and most frankly summed up the whole sorry story. That had the Commission listened to Patriarcha, the master mason, cheaper, quicker, safer, Rome would now still have another column to look at. It mightn't have been the most interesting one because it wasn't decorated in any way, but at least it might have been saved for us to admire. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron, for that horrifying story of cowboy builders. A wonderful mine of new information and treasure trove with witty sides as well. So they're fantastic stories to be told. It must have been, if you're a Cavalier Fontana and you're trying to establish a direct line to Domenica Fontana, and this thing comes out of the ground. So too good to be true.
Too good to be.
An opportunity to Christianise
That's
Rome
right.
and alla Sextus V.
That's right.
Before turning to your questions, just wanted to ask a bit more about why you think the column looked the way it did in antiquity, and why it's so different from Trajan's columns. Was this red granite interesting and no sculptural relief? Is that because nothing happened in the time of Antoninus Pius?
20 years, that's right. Well, to get the answer to that, we'd have to ask Marcus Aurelius. He thought this was satisfactory as a commemoration of his adopted father. Of course, his own column wasn't yet erected, so he didn't have that to vie with his father's, but he had the column of Trajan, of course. But then, you see, the main problem with Antoninus Pius is, remember, he never left Italy. Unlike Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, who spent most of their time on the frontiers in war, Antoninus Pius spent most of his time at his country estates, and the empire was at peace. So how could you decorate the column? And if it was granite, of course, you can't do it. If it's granite, you can't do reliefs. An interesting question. You're quite right. I mean, why is it so simple? Questions?
Thank you. Can I ask about the restoration of the base? So the story that you, fantastic story. I love that story, and especially that it ended so well. With that we can actually see the remains of the granite in the obelisks and so on. But the base. So if we're imagining it being kind of yanked up and various bits kind of being knocked off, did any of the fragments get recovered? Are any of the additions,
yes.
Are they original?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so. In Louisa Vogel's book, if you look at it, she actually has photographs of some separate fragments, which are never put back.
Oh, right. And where are they? Are they in the Vatican Museum?
Presumably in the Vatican Museum. Somewhere, but I've asked Carlo Pietrangeli, he's long dead, but I asked him about the French excavations. Was there stuff to be found? He said, it's probably in the magazines, but you'd never find it.
Thank you.
Yes. It's Robert's question, I'm afraid. Go ahead.
It's a question which may not be answerable, but do we know anything about the original context of the column, where it sat within the city, whether it was part of a larger complex of monuments?
No, we don't. I'll have to. We can find that, though. I hadn't thought to look precisely at that, but we can do it easily by looking at Lanciani's former urbis. Yes, his plan of the ancient city, and just see if anything's there. It must have been in a fairly open space. I mean, he wouldn't put an imperial monument up crammed into buildings. So there must have been a pretty substantial piazza or something of the like. But I haven't checked that. Thank you very much. I'll do that. Lanciani is the man, once again, to tell us the answer.
Actually, I was going to ask the same question. really, but how many of these erudite monographs that you were citing from the 18th century, did any of them actually ask that very question and suggest what exactly the column was for?
No.
They weren't interested in the antiquity?
Because there's overwhelming question of how we deal with it and what do we do now.
Presumably it was a funerary monument of some kind.
Yes, it's thought to be a commemoration of his cremation and divinization. Yeah, so sometime in 161, presumably, I've just forgotten the exact month and day of his death, but if there were a couple of months' space, it'd be enough. Since it's already to hand, you don't have to make it; it's there. It may well have been. It may well have been near where he was cremated, the Ostrinum. They are all round there, aren't they? Of course, it's the Campus Martius. The Campus Martius where burials are carried out, yes. Yes.
Since it wasn't decorated, and you've made the point that obviously he's not an emperor who's come back from triumph and doesn't therefore have a history of narrative story, can you tell us what the base shows? Because the base clearly is decorated, and I wonder what the narrative, insofar as it survives and or hasn't been over-restored by the 19th century, what does that tell us about him in particular, or does it not tell us about him at all?
No, I don't think it tells us about him. It tells us about Marcus Aurelius' commemoration of him. So you have on the two sides, this is one of the two sides, the decursio, which is the funerary cavalry march past in his honour, and you have, of course, the most famous scene of all, which I didn't show because it's only got, 4 figures or so, which shows it's the most famous scene of all. It shows the apotheosis of both Antoninus Pius and his wife, Faustina the Elder, with a personification of the Campus Martius, holding an obelisk, as I remember, and a winged genius, or whatever. So that the central scene commemorates their actual death and divinization. So it's pretty simple and straightforward, and there's no complicated message, and nothing at the back. The sides are decorated.
The contrast in style between that apotheosis and these sort of merry-go-round bird's eye views.
Yes, bird's eye view, yes. And another thing I forgot to say, so many things that you could say about it, is that Louise Vogel points out that since all these things are restoration, there has been an homogenization of the two sides. In other words, the modern restorers have imagined they were both pretty much the same, and they may not have been the same originally. But they've been made so by the restoration. So and you have people like, I'm amazed to say even people like Ennio Corino Visconti, that genius who was the greatest antiquarian after Winckelmann at the end of the 18th century here in Rome. He was one of the consuls of the Jacobin Republic and had to flee for his life, of course, when the Republic fell. He headed off to Paris and became curator of the Louvre of antiquities there. So he went from one stellar career in Rome to another in Paris. He said, what fine style these sculptures are, little knowing that, of course, he wasn't talking about classical sculpture really at all. Not much, anyway.